Thank you very much. It's really a privilege for me to be asked to speak on this occasion, and it's a real pleasure to meet three persons whom I have known for a very long time. Monojit, I remember you very well from Cambridge, and of course Akbar and Akeel, I keep meeting, and it has been really one of the pleasures of my life. Their friendship has enriched my life greatly. Thank you very much, therefore, for giving me this opportunity. I'd be talking about 3 decades of economic liberalization today, on which there have been a number of articles in various magazines and so on, because economic liberalization began in 1991 in India, and therefore there has been a spate of writing on this whole question of what these 3 decades have brought. I think on one question there is no doubt that in the very recent period, there has been an increase in acute distress of the mass of the Indian population. On that, there is no doubt. But the point is, since when this distress began has been a matter of debate. The government spokesman would say that this is something which began with the pandemic. That during the pandemic, obviously, people became much worse off. Lockdown meant that they were thrown out of work, and many of them were thrown out of their residence, and therefore they had to trudge miles and miles. And everybody agrees that there has been an acute distress during this period of the pandemic. As a matter of fact, the rescue cum relief package, which the government of India has provided for people during this pandemic, is no more than about 1% of GDP, compared to the fact that even Donald Trump, who's not known to be a great friend of the poor, during the pandemic provided an initial rescue and relief package amounting to 10% of the US GDP, Germany 5% and so on, and in India, by contrast, only 1%, even though large numbers of economists and political parties were demanding much more than that. But anyway, about the pandemic, there's no doubt. But many persons, particularly people belonging to the opposition Congress party, have been saying that long before the pandemic, since BJP came to power, since 2014, there has been an increase in people's distress, by which I mean an absolute worsening in the conditions of the people. That measures like demonetization, measures like, as they say, the mode of introduction of the goods and services tax have really squeezed the informal sector, because of which this has actually caused great damage to the economy. And that since the informal sector employs, a very large proportion of the workforce, about 85%, it follows that they have been thrown into acute distress. As a matter of fact, in 2019, just before the pandemic, it was estimated that the level of unemployment, or I should say, the unemployment rate in the economy was higher than at any time since the preceding 45 years. The highest unemployment rate. 45 years ago, you had the oil price hike, because of which there was a kind of, a spurt in unemployment. But as a matter of fact, while both these propositions are correct, that the pandemic has worsened the conditions of people, and it has worsened the conditions of people who were already becoming worse off during the preceding few years. Nonetheless, I think this misses the point that over the entire neoliberal period, there has been an absolute worsening in the conditions of large numbers of the people, of the Indian people. Let me give some statistics to substantiate this claim, which is really, would appear to many as being fairly outlandish. It's certainly not something which is commonly accepted. If you look at, let's say, per capita food grain availability, because as you know, recently India was ranked 101st, 101th in the World Hunger Index, and therefore hunger is a very obvious criterion by which one can assess the conditions of the people in the country. So if you look at the beginning of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, per capita food grain availability, by which I mean net production plus net imports minus net additions to government stocks. We don't know much of anything about private stocks, minus net additions to government stocks. Per capita food grain availability in what was then called British India at the beginning of the 20th century was about 200 kilograms per year. By the time of independence in 1947, this had really sharply come down. In fact, in the year of independence, it was absurdly low, 136 kilograms, but that's because of the partition and so on. Even if you take the period on the eve of independence, taking out the effects of partition, that means you take a year before, then nonetheless, the per capita food grain availability had fallen below 150 kilograms. In fact, the last 50 years of colonialism were actually a disastrous period for the people. After independence, with great effort, and this is something which is not often appreciated when people attack the post-independence dirigist regime, statist regime that actually came into the economic life of the nation. This was with great difficulty increased to about 180 kilograms, from less than 150 to 180 kilograms by the end of the 1980s. That means on the eve of economic liberalization. After that, it declined to about 165 and then climbed up again, so that for the latest year, before the pandemic, it was about 178 kilograms. And if it's 178 kilograms overall, then it would follow that since the rich were during this period experiencing, for reasons I'm going to discuss, increases in their per capita income and their consumption of food grains, both taking direct and indirect ingestion. By indirect, I mean through animal products and processed food, tends to increase with real income. Then you'd find that the per capita absorption by the poor, by the vast masses of the people, must have really declined. Certainly declined during this period. And we have, again, some direct evidence for this. We have, for instance, the National Sample Survey on consumption expenditures. It turns out that the proportion of population in rural India, which consumes below 2,200 calories per person per day, which is the definition of poverty in India, in rural poverty, that proportion increased from about 58% in 1993-4 to 68% in 2011-12. I'm deliberately taking a period which is well before either the pandemic or the coming into prominence of Mr. Narendra Modi. So you actually find that there was a sharp increase in poverty as defined through hunger. For urban areas, the corresponding figures were 57% and 65%. 57% in 1993-4 and 65% in 2011-12. I take these particular years because they were the years of National Sample Survey. After 2011-12, there has been such a shocking worsening in the conditions of the people that the next survey, that is 2017-18, was actually suppressed by the Modi government. Its results were not even released. But whatever was kind of leaked out to the press suggests that per capita total expenditure in real terms in rural India fell by 9% between 2011-12 and 17-18. And this is a very unusual situation. It's really kind of extremely surprising to find that such a sharp drop in per capita real expenditure, consumption expenditure in rural India. Never before had it happened. So it is clear that there is a prolonged period of absolute worsening of the conditions of life of vast masses of people in India, particularly in rural India. Now, I believe there's a reason for it. It's not just a statistical quirk. I mean, I think there's a reason for it, and that reason is the following. That when you find, neoliberalism basically entails that there is relatively unrestricted movement of goods and services and of capital, including finance, across national borders, across national boundaries. Cross-border capital flow is something which is kind of relatively unrestricted. Now, that basically implies that capital, or finance in particular, which is highly mobile, becomes globalized. But while finance becomes globalized, the states are nation states. So you have globalized finance confronting individual nation states. Now, if that is the case, then of course the ability of the nation state to pursue any policies of its choice, to pursue any policies which may improve the conditions of the people, that ability is restricted because the nation state is constrained to pursue policies which are dictated by finance. This is something which Keynes had noted as a possible contradiction. He had actually said finance above all must be national. If it is the case that the state had to have some control over the economy, then you cannot have a nation state which opens its boundaries to globalized flows of finance. But that's exactly what has happened in neoliberalism, because of which the state basically, no matter whom you elect, pursues roughly the same set of policies. Therefore, this has, of course, very important implications for democracy and so on. If democracy means sovereignty of the people, then sovereignty of the people is substituted by the sovereignty of finance, because basically it is the demands of finance which particular countries have to follow if they're going to retain what is called the confidence of the investors, because alternatively finance would just flow out en masse from that particular country, creating a financial crisis. Now, this, of course, has implications for government policies across the board. But one particular implication which I would be concerned with in the course of this lecture is the fact that during the pre-neoliberal period, what I call the dirigist period, the government, because in a sense it was a legacy of the freedom struggle, a promise that had been made, the government pursued a number of policies supporting, sustaining, protecting the informal sector, petty production, peasant agriculture. Now, this is very well known. There was a whole mechanism of subsidized inputs, protection from the implications of, world price fluctuations. As a matter of fact, the Indian anti-colonial struggle took off in a very big way in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. And during that period, one of the promises of the anti-colonial struggle was, which the peasantry joined in large numbers during that period, one of the promises was that come independence, and you'd never be exposed to such a crisis again. And therefore, there was protection through quantitative restrictions, through tariffs and so on, from world market price fluctuations, subsidized inputs, including subsidized credit after bank nationalization, and of course, the provision of a mechanism of minimum support price, procurement price, and assured remunerative price to the peasant. I'm not saying for a moment that everybody got that price. Quite often, the government agents would come after the price had crashed and so on. But whatever it is, there was something on paper that protected the peasantry and protected certainly large numbers of peasants against price falls. By the way, it is the removal of that protection through the three farm laws against which the peasants have been agitating on the borders of Delhi for a whole year, and against which they yesterday won a big battle with the government climbing down and saying it's going to repeal those three farm laws. Anyway, but there was therefore a certain effort to maintain the profitability of agriculture, but all these are now being progressively withdrawn. Subsidization of inputs is now over. Then you find, certainly even subsidization of credit is over, in the sense that, of course, you have priority sector lending. So much has to go for priority sector within which there is agriculture. But if Coca-Cola sets up a plant in a rural area, that is included in priority sector. So the definition of priority sector is such that the peasants are increasingly denied institutional credit. And then you find that government research and development is virtually out. Government extension services, through which the fruits of research and development in public sector research establishments used to be distributed, the extensions network has been wound up. World's largest extension network has just been wound up. Then, of course, while as I mentioned, the Narendra Modi government removing the procurement mechanism or the minimum support price mechanism, that mechanism had already been removed long before Narendra Modi came to power with regard to cash crops. But that mechanism still remains with regard to food crops, about 22, 23 of them, which the Modi government was trying to remove. So cash crop prices fluctuate, and of course you have removal of quantitative restrictions under WTO. Therefore, world market price fluctuations increasingly affect the Indian farmers, pushing them into debt and so on, because of which you have had large numbers of peasant suicides, that almost 300,000 peasants have committed suicide over the last 2.5 decades. So agriculture was being pushed into distress and crisis because of the fact that the government, in matters of economic policy, was more or less pursuing an agenda which is dictated by globalized finance capital. And that, by the way, would be one reason, Akeel, why I imagine the BBC would in fact be so critical of the government for giving in to the farmers. So now this shows itself. In fact, if you look at the 2018-19 National Sample Survey findings, you find that in real terms, the profitability of the agricultural sector has become negative. That, in 2018-19. So this is something which has been happening over a long period of time. Distress of the peasants, peasant suicides and so on are very well-known, well-attested phenomena. But one implication of this is, of course, then peasants also migrate out of agriculture. Between 1991 and 2011 census, you find that the number of cultivators, the census defines only two categories, cultivators and agricultural laborers. The number of cultivators declined by 15 million. Some of them would have become laborers and others must have migrated to the cities. So one very important implication of this neoliberal policy has been the assault on petty production because of withdrawal of government support. Uh, Now I come to the second implication, that while they migrate to the urban areas in search of jobs, in urban areas, the provision of employment tends to slow down greatly. In fact, during the dirigist period, pre-neoliberal period, per year, about 2% was the employment growth. During the neoliberal period, when the GDP growth has increased quite substantially, the employment growth rate has become 1%. So while the GDP growth has virtually doubled, the employment growth rate has actually virtually halved. And this is something which actually implies that the rate of growth of employment is even lower than the natural rate of growth of the workforce. So let alone absorbing the peasants who are migrating, distressed migration from the countryside, you actually have a situation where even the natural rate of growth of the workforce in urban areas is not being absorbed. Therefore, this migration and this non-absorption of the natural rate of growth of the workforce simply adds to what Marx would have called the reserve army of labor, a huge mass of unemployed, underemployed persons. I should perhaps just add here that in India, it is not the open unemployment that goes up. What tends to happen is the same number of jobs tend to get rationed out among a larger number of people. Therefore, each works for a shorter period of time, and that is why underemployment increases. The very swelling of the ranks of the underemployed implies absolute immiserization. If you're a peasant and you become an underemployed urban laborer, then of course you become absolutely worse off. But what is more, this also implies that wages of even the organized workers, who constitute about 5%, let us say, of the total workforce, do not increase because of the loss of bargaining strength of trade unions. Trade unions have virtually been decimated under neoliberalism in most of these third world countries, including in India. In fact, in most of the first world countries as well. Among other things, because of privatization of public sector enterprises, but also because of the increase in the reserve army of labor. I should say, to explain the triptych remark, that unionization is much greater in the public sector than in the private sector. In the US, in the private sector, about 7% of the workforce is unionized, while in the public sector, including education, it's about 33%. So any privatization tends to mean that unionization then gets kind of, unionization suffers, and therefore even the bargaining strength of the workers who are organized tends to go down. Now, both these have a very important implication to which I now come. And that implication is that the real wages of workers across the world, really speaking, do not increase because of the fact that in the United States, for instance, because of the movement of capital, because of the location of activities by capital in the third world, in the US, you find that the bargaining strength of the workers goes down, real wages do not increase. There is, Joe Stiglitz has got this figure which says that if you compare 1968 with 2011, then the real average real wage of a male industrial worker in the United States was marginally lower in 2011 compared to 1968. But certainly, if you look at the third world countries, even countries like India, then you find that the real wages do not increase, precisely because of the rise in the proportion of the reserve army of labor. But while real wages don't increase, labor productivity increases, which after all is why employment does not increase, which is why the labor market doesn't get tightened. And because of that, the proportion of surplus in total output, surplus meaning productivity minus wages is the surplus, that divided by productivity is the proportion of surplus. The proportion of surplus in output is something which increases within each country and also across countries in the world as a whole. This is something which actually people like Piketty have been pointing out, and they have not been providing this explanation. But the fact that there is an increase in inequality across the world in this period is something which people like Piketty have been pointing out. For instance, their estimate is that in India, their estimate is that in India in 2013-14, you actually had the share of the national income going to 1%, the top 1% of the population, being higher than at any time since 1922. And why 1922? Because they make estimates based on income tax data, and the income tax was introduced in India in 1922. So the share of the top 1% in the total national income is higher in 2013-14, the last year for which their figures I have come across, than at any time since 1922. And what is more, in 1982, that share had gone down to as low as 6%, while now it is 22%. So there is an increase in inequality. But the other implication, which I would like to emphasize, is that the shift from wages to surplus basically implies a tendency towards overproduction. If you give a rupee, for instance, to a worker, the worker would probably consume the entire rupee. But you give the rupee to anyone who lives off the surplus, which basically means not just the capitalists, but also tax lawyers and advertisement agencies and so on, then the proportion of the rupee that they would consume would be much less. So every such income redistribution tends to reduce the level of consumption, other things remaining the same, which basically implies a tendency towards overproduction. Now, this tendency towards overproduction can be kept in check through state intervention, of course. And state intervention would have to be through financing state spending, increased state spending, either by taxes on capitalists or through a fiscal deficit. You see, taxes on capitalists implies that you shift a rupee from them to the government spends the rupee, but the rupee that you shift from the capitalists, let's say part of it was saved. Therefore, there's a net increase in demand. You shift a rupee from the worker to the state and the state spends, the worker would have spent that rupee anyway. Therefore, there's no net increase in demand. Likewise, if it is a fiscal deficit, then of course that nobody is being taxed. As a result, there is a net expansion of demand. So government expenditure financed either by a fiscal deficit or by a tax on the surplus, I'm using the category surplus, is something that would be generating a net expansion of demand and therefore keeping at bay this tendency towards overproduction. But on the other hand, that is precisely the kind of thing that globalized finance capital would not like. And because of that, governments have not been doing it. On the contrary, governments across the third world, and especially the government of India, has been going around giving tax concessions to the capitalists in order to attract more investment and have a higher GDP growth rate and so on. Because of which, the ability of the state to intervene in a manner that would keep the tendency to overproduction in check is something which is undermined under neoliberalism. But on the other hand, Therefore, if the neoliberal period has seen high growth rates, partly, of course, it is because of the relocation of activities from the first to the third world, and partly, of course, because in the world economy itself, there have been booms of sorts because of the formation of asset price bubbles. There was the dot-com bubble in the 1990s, and there was the housing bubble earlier this century. Because of these, the world economy has been kind of, was booming in the 1990s and earlier part of the century. But with the collapse of the housing bubble, the world economy has moved into a period of stagnation, which also affects countries like India. In India, for a while, it was offset through the government enlarging its expenditures through a fiscal deficit, but this soon reached its limits, after which there has been a slowing down of the growth rate of the Indian economy, which of course makes itself felt in terms of higher levels of unemployment. And as I mentioned, in 2019, the unemployment rate was higher than it had ever been in the last 45 years. Prior to that, that is. Okay, so if neoliberalism, even before it got into a crisis, had introduced a process of absolute immiserization for large masses of people, at least immiserization in terms of greater hunger, the period of crisis of neoliberalism has, of course, made things worse because of the absence of purchasing power, because of unemployment that people have increasingly been suffering from. I mean, accentuated unemployment that they have been suffering from. Now, this creates a very fertile ground for the growth of neo-fascism. And I would attribute the emergence of neo-fascism in India to this phenomenon. Typically, periods of capitalist crisis are, of course, periods in which fascism thrives because the big business, big capital, then finds that it would have to make alliances with the fascist elements in society. In a modern society, fascist elements are always there, but they remain in the fringes. They are brought center stage only when they are financed by big capital, and therefore they help big capital retain its hegemony by other means, even when the earlier prop that sustained big capital's hegemony is being undermined by crisis. In India, for instance, this is something which has taken the form of a corporate Hindutva alliance, where basically the change in discourse, where the Hindu-Muslim issue is exaggerated, creating hatred against the minority, against the religious minority, and thereby changing the discourse so that material conditions of life of the people do not even enter into the discourse. For a very long time, this government had been under the impression that no matter how the economy is functioning, they can always manage to win elections by creating a communal riot in time or by spreading hatred against the religious minority. And this continues to this day. As a matter of fact, almost everybody in India is agreed that before the coming elections, because the government's performance in the realm of the economy and in the realm of people's material conditions of life has been so abysmal that they are going to all the more do such things in order to win the coming elections. Anyway, so the corporate Hindutva alliance, or if you like, the neoliberal, neo-fascist alliance, is a way of providing a prop to the neoliberal regime at a time when the standard prop that was earlier there, namely that, sooner or later with this very high growth rate, you are going to get the benefits of a trickle down, that prop disappears because the growth rate itself tends to fall. So that doesn't carry any credibility, because of which now you have a new kind of thing which arises, a new backdrop for establishing the hegemony of the corporate financial oligarchy that is integrated into globalized finance capital, and therefore you have a neoliberal, neo-fascist alliance, which in India takes the form of a corporate Hindu alliance. But there is a basic difference between classical fascism and contemporary neo-fascism. Classical fascism, that means in the 1930s, when exactly a similar situation had arisen, classical fascism had, in fact, because of military expenditures financed by government borrowing, had actually enlarged employment. Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression. Germany in 1933, after Hitler came to power, came out of the depression by providing employment. Because of its militarization, because of substantial military expenditures, which were financed by a fiscal deficit. So, classical fascism actually provided a solution to the unemployment problem, not an ideal solution by any means, but nonetheless a solution of sorts, because of which there was a period between 1933, let us say, and in Germany till about 1939, when the fascists were actually quite popular because they had got people out of the distress of unemployment, but at the same time, the horrors of war had not visited Germany. But in countries like ours, the neo-fascists cannot even achieve that kind of employment, that kind of alleviation of the distress of unemployment for reasons I've just mentioned, because fiscal deficit as a mode of financing government expenditure is something which is out, because we live in a world where the government has very little kind of control over finance capital. On the contrary, the government has to accede to the demands of finance capital, which of course wants the fiscal deficit curtailed. Now, for this reason, therefore, neo-fascism is not even going to achieve the kind of alleviation of unemployment which classical fascism had achieved. And this has a number of implications. The first implication, of course, is that it will become more and more vicious, therefore. Come elections, since they have not had much to show by way of achievements in the realm of the economy, they would really resort much more to militaristic adventures or to communal rioting and so on in order to establish their kind of political hegemony. And this is something which therefore would become more acute. So that is the dangerous part of this, namely that they would have nothing to show when it comes to the economy. The second thing is that, of course, that in many circumstances, precisely because of the fact that they have nothing to show, and of course you cannot just do communal rioting at will and ad infinitum, they may have to make sometimes concessions, like they did yesterday to the peasantry, and everybody knows that these concessions were because of the ground reports that they got that in UP there is going to be a substantial erosion in western and central UP in the support base of the ruling government. And of course, if you do not have UP where you can form a government, then that affects your entire national prospects. That basically you can't rule India unless you rule UP. So the thing is that that occasional concessions would have to be made. And of course, every such concession basically also creates confusion in the ranks of the neo-fascists. Many who had, for instance, been abusing the peasants as being Khalistanis, as being terrorists, as being kind of, anti-national and so on, are really now in a quandary how to react to Modi's capitulation on the three farm laws. The third implication of the fact that you cannot have a provision of employment like in the old days is that therefore there would be a prolonged period that countries like ours would be having neo-fascism. That okay, even if they get out of power, they are going to remain around, and therefore they would be with us for a long time, and there would be a prolonged fascification of the Indian society, with the sowing of the kind of seeds of hatred which the government has actually already introduced. To get out of this predicament, therefore, it is important to, as I've been arguing, this predicament is a result essentially of the neoliberal economic regime. And to get out of this predicament, it is important to get out of the neoliberal economic regime. Why? Because tomorrow, even if you have a government that comes to power at the expense of the fascists, unless it is the case that the government can provide some substantial improvement in the conditions of life of the people, then the discourse would still remain Hindu, Muslim, and such like things, rather than a discourse of improving the conditions of people's lives. Therefore, if you're going to provide such a discourse, if you're going to provide an alternative arrangement in which people become better off, and their concerns shift away from the promotion of hatred, which the current government has been doing, then you will have to have the state having a certain degree of autonomy. That degree of autonomy it can get only if it can de-link from globalized financial flows. If you are linked to globalized financial flows, in that case, you would be more or less pursuing very similar policies. Nothing to do with what you call your politics. Tomorrow, even if the Maoists come to power in India and continue to remain a part of globalized financial flows, they would be pursuing more or less the same policies that the Manmohan Singh government was pursuing. And consequently, during their rule as well, you would have exactly the same process of immiserization that you had during the earlier period. So it is very important, therefore, to think in terms of delinking from this, which of course is very difficult because you know that the moment you do that, in the run-up to the delinking, there would be substantial capital outflows. And what is more, even if you succeed in delinking, even if you succeed in delinking by putting capital controls, by preventing outflows, then you would not even have inflows. Finance is not going to come in if it is the case that it can't go out at will. And if so, then you'd find it difficult to finance your trade deficit. And to the extent that is the case, you would have to have import controls. And that in turn, at least for a certain period of time, a big country like India can produce virtually everything it requires. But for a certain period of time, you would have people's being hit by such absence of imports. And what is more, even if you can actually get people's consent to this temporary sacrifice, there's always the pressure from the United States and other advanced countries for sanctions against such a deviant economy. And of course, these sanctions in turn are going to hurt the economy, hurt the society, hurt the people, the very people in whose interests, with whose support an alternative government would be coming to power. But nonetheless, these have to be faced. But of course, if these have to be faced, then you have to have an alternative agenda. Now, I believe that this alternative agenda cannot just be a set of promises. This alternative agenda, to my mind, to be credible, must entail the introduction of a set of fundamental economic rights. We have in the Constitution a set of fundamental political rights, which of course are violated by authoritarian governments like the current one. But on the other hand, it's not enough to have fundamental political rights, but we have to have a set of fundamental economic rights which are universal, which are justiciable, and which are constitutionally guaranteed. Now, these fundamental economic rights, I mean, all these are there in the directive principles of state policy that is in the Constitution, but they have to be made operative and they have to be made justiciable. True that the courts may not, courts tend to shy away from pronouncing on these rights, but nonetheless, it provides some kind of a support to the people. And of course, I have immediately the question of rights is raised. People are going to say, where are the resources? I made a small calculation in which I was wondering if you have 5 fundamental rights: right to food, which means basically everybody gets food through the public distribution system at the same price at which currently the below poverty line population is getting. The right to employment, by which I mean everybody gets employment, or failing the provision of employment, everybody is given a wage as close as possible to the existing market. I mean, the wage they would have got had they got jobs. In other words, a level of unemployment benefit which is pretty close to the wage rate. Then a right to free, universal, quality education provided by the state, at least up to the higher secondary level, universal for everybody. A right to free, universal health care for everybody, provided by the state along the lines of a national health service, and of course a right to disability benefits and old age pensions. You'd be non-contributory old age pensions. You'd be amazed to know that the old age pension which is currently given by the central government is 200 rupees per month, which is a joke, which is absurd. In fact, it should be about 3,000 rupees per month, if not more, but at least 3,000 rupees. So a right to a living old age, non-contributory old age pension and disability benefits. So if you take these rights, then roughly by my calculations, over and above what is spent on these heads currently from the budget, you would require about 10% of the GDP. And this 10% of the GDP you can get by having just 2 taxes being imposed on the top 1% of the population. One tax is a wealth tax of 2%, 2% of the wealth, which is imposed only on the top 1% of the population. And the other is an inheritance tax of about 1/3 of whatever is passed down of a person's wealth, which is again imposed on the top 1% of the population. These 2 taxes, of course, complement one another. If you have a wealth tax without inheritance tax, then people would just distribute their wealth among progeny. But on the other hand, therefore, you have to have an inheritance tax to go with the wealth tax. And a 2% wealth tax, I should remind you, in the US elections, which just got over, both Elizabeth Warren as well as Bernie Sanders had suggested a 2% wealth tax on a much larger proportion of the population than just the 1% that I am talking about. So this is perfectly feasible. And with this, we can turn India into a welfare state. And what is more, we can actually provide guaranteed fundamental economic rights, write them into the Constitution. Now, this is something which we therefore have to kind of, visualize. And for that reason, to go beyond the neoliberal regime through capital controls and having an agenda of this kind. Of course, it won't be easy to have such an agenda because of international pressure. But on the other hand, if we do not do this, then societies like ours would really have to live with the pains of hatred and communal strife for decades to come. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Prabhat. Now I invite Professor Nouman Akbar Sahab to do his concluding remarks, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Prabhat. It's always a very, very hard act to follow. To this incredibly wide-ranging talk, you've covered so many issues in such a short period of time, and absolutely brilliant exposition, as always, Prabhat. I don't know. Let me raise a few questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about more broadly, how does India compare with some other phenomenon in countries in the world? One is, of course, this is a little bit puzzling, that India is a puzzle in many respects. There's been, as you say, a significant increase in the GDP growth rate. Growth rate of the economy has gone up from whatever it was, about 3.5% or so before 1970 or 1980, to about 5 to 6% in the 80s and 6 to 7% more recently. Although there's been more fluctuation in recent years, up and down. But anyway, the point is that if you look at globally, we find a very high correlation between median income, and headcount poverty. In fact, as much as 0.99, actually, if you run some measures. Also, of course, a very high correlation between changes in income and changes in poverty, negative correlation. Why is India such an exception to this global phenomenon? And the contrast with China is obvious because it's the other giant economy where there's been a very rapid reduction in poverty along with accelerated growth. And why is India so different? One, of course, the explanation has been the polling performance on employment in India. That is absolutely clear that employment has done very badly in the last 20 years or so, and increasingly so, particularly in the last 10 years or 15 years. That is one part of the explanation. It has to do with also the fact that India has not succeeded in increasing manufacturing output very much. So the question is a little bit, and as you know, also there are various other measures of poverty in India, headcount poverty through various poverty lines, and there's a variety of measures, and there's sort of so-called the Great Indian Poverty Debate. So whereas the per capita grain availability explanation is compelling, obviously, people have tended to because of substitution of higher quality, other kind of foods from grains, people eating more dairy and so on, vegetables. I don't know, how to reconcile these various different measures, and I'd like you to comment a little bit on that if you feel up to it. But the Indian puzzle is quite... The other question is, of course, where do you draw the line between liberalization and neoliberalization? What exactly one means by neoliberal in this context? And there has been certainly a tendency, but some would say that India has not fully embraced neoliberalism, as would be the argument on the right-wing side by people like Panagaria and Bhagwati and so on. Otherwise, there is very little else I can say or contribute to this, and I don't know enough about India, obviously, nothing compared to the kind of depth of study and knowledge you have, Prabhat, over the years. But the puzzle that India and how it's different from the rest of the world is one which obviously calls for some explanation and clarification. Thank you very much, Prabhat. It was very enlightening, as always, listening to you, although I've heard many times various contexts. Always I learn something new from you, and as always, it's edifying and fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So before we go to a question and answer session, just an announcement for the coming Saturday event. That is our every last Saturday of the month is a cultural event. it is obvious that today we have a announcement on celebrating music legend Ghulam Muhammad. So please join us coming Saturday. Now over to Dr. Rafat Hussain, who will be moderating this question and answer session. Rafat.
Thank you, Razi bhai. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Patnaik, Professor Bilgrami, Professor Noman, Professor Chatterjee. It is a pleasure to have so many professors among us, and of course, the professors from Oxford University. Wow. So thank you, Professor Patnaik, for teaching us the fundamentals of the economics and also proposing the solutions for the current predicament going on in India. And it is amazing that just the 10% GDP can cover the right of the employment, right of education, right of health issues, right of disability, all those things, unbelievable. So now this session is open for question and answer. And as usual, there are two options. One is you raise your digital hand or show your interest in the chat box. You can simply say, I have a question. So I will follow that and ask the question. The questions. Currently, okay, I do have one hand raised. Mr. Hassan Ghias. And so please unmute yourself. And next is Professor Bilgrami. So go ahead, Akeel Saab. Hassan Ghias Saab.
The picture painted by Professor Patnaik really is scary and very dire, in the sense that we seem to be locked into a situation from which it's very hard to escape. The delinking of India from the global financial flows, as Professor Prabhat rightly pointed out, is not going to be easy. And whether there'll be a political will to do it is debatable. If that doesn't happen, then this continued immiserization of the population at the base will continue to happen. And with the government's divisive agenda of creating communal tensions and divide, will mean that there could be huge social upheavals in India in the years to come, and in particular in the years running up to the 2024 elections. So are we kind of locked into a destiny on which we have no control, but which is very, very scary? Or is there a way out of this predicament where we can avoid huge social unrest and social upheavals, particularly of a communal character?
Thank you, Ghias Saab. Prabhat Saab, you are on mute. Professor Patnaik, you are on mute.
But shall I answer right now?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Then let me begin with Akbar's very important questions. You see, the poverty estimates on the basis of which people say that poverty has gone down, so many billions have been raised out of poverty and so on, are basically based on the World Bank's poverty line, $2 per day or whatever. Now, the World Bank's poverty line, in turn, is essentially the poverty line suggested by big countries like India and China and so on. You know, it's not as if the World Bank has its own estimates. It basically takes member countries' estimates. And of course, India and China play a very big role. But on the other hand, let's say the Indian current official estimates, obviously these are official estimates, the official estimate of poverty in India is increasingly deviating from the original figure. Originally, what was it? That level of per capita daily expenditure at which a person accessed 2,200 calories in rural India, 2,100 calories in urban India. So he just went down to find out exactly what is the cutoff point corresponding to the calorie intake and what is the expenditure level. But now what has happened is that, as a matter of fact, you see, there has been enormous increase in prices, partly because of privatization of health and education and so on, which is not really captured in the national consumer price index. As a result, suppose it is the case that a person, say my father falls ill, I take him to a hospital, but now no longer government hospitals, I take him to a private hospital. When I take him to a private hospital, I pay through my nose. And when I pay through my nose, the only way that I can actually manage to make ends meet is by curtailing my consumption of food grains or borrowing. Therefore, you find that indebtedness goes up, and you also find that consumption of food grains goes down. But on the other hand, this happens because there is an underestimation of inflation. Now, the government estimate is that for the initial date, they have this cutoff point called poverty line at which everybody accesses the calories that are the benchmark. But on the other hand, they bring it up by using the consumer price index. But since the consumer price index itself understates the price rise, the poverty line today would really understate what should be the appropriate poverty line. And because of that, you find that with understated poverty lines, there is much greater improvement in the poverty figure, that, many more millions are supposed to have been raised. As a matter of fact, that's not the case. So my own feeling is that it is because the actual inflation is not captured in bringing up the poverty line up to date that you have this divergence between the nutritional poverty and the actual poverty estimates by World Bank and others, or even the official estimates. This is something which was made quite clear, particularly during the pandemic, when suddenly it came as a surprise that hundreds of thousands of people were on the road marching back to their villages because they had nothing. So the fact that they did not, that it suddenly came as a surprise to everybody that there are so many destitute people in the country who have absolutely nothing to fall back upon. So I would say that, that is a puzzle that can be resolved if we look at the fact that the method of estimating poverty is by bringing it up to date with some consumer price index, which itself understates the price rise. By the way, the Chinese suddenly decided to double their poverty line because they were actually showing such low levels of poverty that it was actually not even credible as far as the government itself was concerned, because of which they decided to just double the poverty line, because of which the magnitude of poverty also increased. Then your other question about, liberalization and neoliberalism. You see, okay, neoliberalism is just to use the term that this is liberalization in a new set of circumstances. I would say that the fundamental difference between the current neoliberal regime and the old regime, let's say in the colonial period, as you know, liberalization characterized the colonial period absolutely to a T. And that's because, for instance, when they introduced for revenue reasons at the beginning of the 20th century, an import duty on imported cloth, in order not to give Indians an advantage, Indian manufacturers, they actually imposed a countervailing excise duty on domestically produced cloths. Now, more liberalism than that, or more liberalization than that, you cannot imagine, because it basically wants to make sure that there is a level playing field between foreign producers and domestic producers. But the difference between that colonial liberalization and today's liberalization is above all the enormous flow of finance that characterizes today's liberalization. That's why when people talk about globalization, that this is only the third episode of globalization, we had globalization earlier, what they miss is that there's a basic difference in this episode and the earlier episode. And this episode is characterized by globalization finance, which actually impinges on the sovereignty of the people, on the ability of the state. I mean, you see country after country. Syriza came to power in Greece, but it did exactly what the previous government was doing. When Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa, there was so much capital flight that Nelson Mandela appointed as his finance minister the same man who had been the finance minister in the preceding apartheid regime. So you can see the way, and you know, in Pakistan, for instance, you actually have had prime ministers dictated by representatives of globalized finance. So it is not at all surprising that this is a new period we are living in, because of which I like the term neoliberal. Okay, Rafat Saab's question. No, sorry. The other question that was raised is that, I mean, this dire picture, no picture I paint can be more dire than the reality. And the reality is that you actually find vast numbers of people who don't have enough to eat. The reality is vast numbers of people who have no house to live in, vast numbers of children begging, at New Delhi, every traffic light you find children begging. So compared to that reality, the picture I'm painting is just nothing. And of course, the reality of millions of religious minority who feel insecure because what the government is doing now. So that is a very stark, contrast it with the time of independence. We began with so much promise. I remember as a child, we had this hope, that there's, by the way, there's a very, very well-known Raj Kapoor film called Boot Polish, where the children are asked, how do you visualize the future? They say, na dukkhon ka na bhukon ka bheed hoga, na dukkhon ka raj hoga. That is what, and that was in early 50s. We actually visualized a world without hunger. We visualized a world in which people would be leading a meaningful life, and so on. So compared to that, look where we are. And I think it's very important that we get out of here. Really very, very important we get out of here. I think, what I suggested is, of course, the way I see our getting out of here. Maybe it may not even be as difficult as I have myself made it out to be. Maybe the international ethos would change. Maybe there would be greater voice for third world countries who want to strike out on their own. It's quite possible. It may not be as difficult, but the point is that we have to be prepared to face these difficulties if they do arise.
Thank you, Professor Chatterjee. Professor Bilgrami, please. Please unmute yourself and you're good to go.
Thank you. Can I ask you a historical question, Prabhat?
Yeah.
So you were, in response to the first question, you mentioned the difficulties of the solution of delinking. But historically, what was the compulsion to adopt neoliberal policies in the first place? That is, what were the difficulties that forced that turn, and could those have been resisted? You see, because because what you described at length and very instructively is all the travails that working people have suffered in the neoliberal period. So the question arises: why was neoliberalism adopted in the first place? What were the compulsions that made India adopt it? Could it have been avoided? Can you just say a little bit about that? Because it would complete the picture more.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I've been thinking about it of late quite a bit. It's a very difficult question. I used to believe that it was essentially because of the contradictions of the dirigist regime, that it got into a fiscal crisis. There was talk those days of a fiscal crisis of the state, that the state doesn't raise enough taxes. The entire regime depends upon increase in government spending. After all, that is something which basically in the earlier regime, the growth of the system depends on increase in government spending, and government cannot increase the spending because it doesn't raise enough taxes, because of tax evasion, because of black money, and so on. Because of all this, you have a fiscal crisis of the state. And in the face of the fiscal crisis of the state, either you have to cut back government expenditure, in which case you have stagnation, or you have to increasingly resort to fiscal deficit, which in that kind of a supply-constrained economy was inflationary. So either you have accelerating inflation or you have a slowing down of the growth rate, or a combination of the two. And that was the way that I used to explain to myself what happened in the earlier period. But the thing is that, we have written about this, one of my colleagues and I, but increasingly, I also feel that there is a very important additional factor. And that additional factor is that, Mikhail Kalecki, the well-known Polish economist, had this idea that the middle class, urban middle class, plays a very important role in societies like ours. Now, the urban middle class was the very important element behind the earlier statist regime, because employment increased, bank nationalization, for instance, suddenly number of bank jobs increased enormously, so that you actually found that the middle class did well out of that period of dirigism. While later, I believe that the middle class increasingly found that opening the economy would actually provide it with greater opportunities. This was partly stimulated by the substantial migration of middle class youth to the advanced countries, began with Britain, then subsequently to the United States. You'd hardly find a Bengali middle class household whose child is in India. They almost all of them are spread all over the world, and particularly in the United States. So that I think suddenly there was this feeling in substantial segments of the middle class that had been a supporter of the dirigist regime, that if we opened up this economy, in that case, we would be able to access much larger jobs and so on. So that in some sense, I see a conflict of interest. Not just a contradiction of the system, that there is. I'm not kind of withdrawing from that earlier explanation, but there is a difference between the middle class interests and, of course, the interests of the workers and peasants. One very important thing in this connection I'd like to say is that, that the middle class hostility to the peasantry, which has been agitating for one whole year, is quite substantial. In other words, is quite substantial. And the fact that the media is so pro-Modi and so pro-neoliberalism, so anti-peasant, is not just that they're all currying favor with the existing government, but I think there is a certain middle-class interest that they're all kind of promoting. I'd like to bring to your notice Gandhiji's remarks about the middle class. You remember he had said that the urban middle class consists of commission agents for foreign companies. he had a deep insight into some of these things, while of course he was all for the peasantry. So I think somewhere I feel that we have to look at that kind of a additional explanation. And they really provide the bulk of the social and intellectual support for neoliberalism. As Akbar was saying, Bhagwati, Panagari, and so on, their intellectual positions would be acceptable to a substantial number of urban middle class youth.
But it's a very interesting thing, isn't it, that we have the concept of democracy and its relatively successful implementation of formal democracy, and yet the middle class always has a much greater influence than one man, one person, one vote would consider. So there's that very fundamental contradiction that's part of capitalist societies, or aspiring capitalist societies. Yeah.
One thing again, as you know, when Modi came to power, there was substantial middle class support for him.
Yes.
And some of it has kind of disappeared, but nonetheless, even to this day, the students of IITs, IIMs, and prestigious institutions, with the exception of JNU, are kind of providing quite a lot of support to him even now. So it is quite significant.
Thank you, Professor. There are many more people.
If there are no more questions, there's one thing that I would really like to understand.
I do have two questions,
yes,
but please go ahead.
No.
Please go ahead.
No, I will come.
We'll come back.
I'll come back.
We'll come back. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Salman Qureshi sir, please. And after that, Qaisar Abbas. Salman Qureshi sir, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, Professor Patnaik, thank you so much for your analysis of this new liberal problem. What do you think of Dr. Raghuram Rajan's prescriptions, or rather recommendations? So he's been talking a lot about, equality and inequalities and the need for, social harmony. Do you think his prescription is part of the new liberal framework and therefore problematic?
Well,
good question.
Yeah. No, I think if Dr. Raghuram Rajan can bring about equality within the context of a neoliberal order, I would be all for it. I'd back him. But the point is that I see a conflict between the neoliberal order and the attempt towards equality. That conflict is the least in the case of the United States. Why? Because of the fact that I think, capital flight of any substantial amount from the United States is not easy to visualize, because the dollar is still considered to be as good as gold by most wealth holders in the world, and therefore you would not. That's why the US does not have this fiscal responsibility legislation. In India, there is a fiscal responsibility legislation that your fiscal deficit cannot exceed a certain percentage of GDP. In all over Europe, there is that. All over the world, there is that, but not in the United States. So perhaps in the US, you can have a person like Joe Biden, who's thinking in terms of having an alternative agenda. But this alternative agenda is not very powerfully articulated in Europe, because in Europe, there is still emphasis on fiscal conservatism, and certainly not in countries like India. In fact, in India at this moment, you have this very peculiar combination where fiscal deficit has to be controlled, and therefore, if the government wishes to spend more, then the government actually raises indirect taxes, not direct taxes on the capitalists, but indirect taxes, particularly the prices of petrol and diesel and cooking gas. And as a result, you have inflation. And at the same time, because much of it affects the ordinary people, you don't even have much expansion of the economy. So you have a peculiar kind of stagflation taking place in India. Now, I believe these are compulsions of the neoliberal order. I mean, it's true that the neo-fascists don't understand economics, but additionally, there are also compulsions of the neoliberal order. And for that reason, if Dr. Rajan's panacea would work within a neoliberal economy, I'd be all for it. But I suspect, I mean, my own perception is different.
Thank you, Professor. Kaisar Abbas, please.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Professor Patnaik, you talked about the connection between new fascism and international capitalism.
Yes.
Do you think the same connection was behind introduction of the 3 agricultural laws by the BJP government? And also, when these laws will be repealed, what will it mean for farmers in Punjab and UP? These two questions.
Okay, you know, the 3 farm laws were essentially carrying forward the neoliberal agenda, just as the anti-labor legislation, which also got which also got enacted during this lockdown, during this pandemic period, were also carrying forward the neoliberal agenda. Fundamentally, what the 3 farm laws would have done is to remove state support, the residual amount of state support to peasant agriculture. Fundamentally, it would have opened up peasant agriculture to corporate capital. Now, this would have had a number of implications. One, of course, is that the peasantry would be at the mercy of the corporates, and including even contract farming. And the experience of contract farming has been very bad as far as the Indian peasants, Punjab peasants are concerned. I have been more concerned about another aspect of these 3 farm laws, in fact, and that is the fact that it would change the pattern of land use away from the production of food grains towards the production of all kinds of other goods, including non-agricultural activities, and that would undermine food security. You see, because there is a thing called food imperialism, that the advanced countries twist your arms in order to give you food. This we saw in Africa, and this is something which, in the mid-60s, when India had an acute food crisis, people used to say ship to mouth, that basically food would be imported and that would go to the people in order to avoid large-scale starvation. That is when there was so much of arm twisting that Indira Gandhi that time and Jagjeevan Ram, who was the Food and Agriculture Minister, they decided that actually let us try and increase food grain production on an absolutely emergency basis to get out of the clutches of food imperialism. So it would have meant corporatization of agriculture, change in the pattern of land use, and so on, because of which I believe that, that's part of the neoliberal agenda, because as I told you, support for petty production and peasant agriculture is really a legacy of the anti-colonial struggle, and it is against, as it were, it's against the immanent tendencies of capitalism. Capitalism wants to encroach on all these, and as a matter of fact, people say that the Adanis had already built big silos and so on in order to store whatever agricultural produce they would be procuring. Till now, Food Corporation of India was procuring food grains, and now you would have no Food Corporation of India. Anybody can procure, and the Adanis had actually built silos and so on. And therefore, in some sense, the government going back on the 3 farm laws also implies going back on the implicit promise that they had made to the big capital in India and to international agribusiness. Already international agribusiness has entered India in the form of providing seeds and so on, which earlier was not the case. I mean, one of the main features of post-independence development is that the state interposed itself between the domestic capitalists and international agribusiness on the one side and the peasants on the other. And the state wants to withdraw from there.
Prabhat, you are muted.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Back to Professor Bilgrami.
So, Prabhat, I'm curious about another. My first question was about an earlier transition to neoliberalism, but I'm also curious about your view on the transition in the neoliberal period from UPA 1 and 2 rule to the BJP rule. And this goes to speak to the point about middle class and its influence, as you mentioned. You see, it seems that one element of that transition was that the corruption of the UPA 2 became a very big issue, and it was effectively called, and it had an effect both on the courts and on the people's perceptions, and it succeeded in toppling the Congress government. So the question I have is partly the relationship between political economy and politics, and that is, who gets to effectively call corruption, and thereby topple governments? You see, because there is no doubt that the BJP is through and through corrupt, right? And it has been throughout its but nobody is effectively able to call it in the way that the UPA 2's corruption was effectively called, so that the people and the courts acted upon it. So, there's a brilliant but appalling but brilliant fascist theorist called Carl Schmitt, who criticized liberalism by saying sovereignty lies in the ability to declare what the exception is, like emergencies and so on in liberalism. So he says, so liberalism can have all these pious claims, but in the end, whoever gets to call the emergency, that's the person who really, that's the place where sovereignty really lies. So I can't help feeling that in these capitalist societies of the sort that the third world has, like India and so on, there seems to be a middle level of sovereignty for who can effectively call corruption, and topple governments. But who is that? I mean, a lot of people say that this BJP government is favoring the Gujarati mafia, and it's got crony capitalism. Okay, so what are the Azim Premjis and the Narayan Murthis doing? Why aren't they, trying to save the Congress party so that, so why isn't corruption being called? Why aren't the other forces that are being excluded speaking out effectively? Where is the sovereignty to call corruption effectively?
No, I agree with you that you see now one of the people who actually who had the maximum role in making UPA 2 unpopular has admitted that his calculations were wrong, that Vinod Rai. Yeah. So the thing is that, that a whole movement got built up, but that movement is one which actually was based on completely wrong set of statistics. Which is not to say that UPA 2 was not corrupt, but you say fundamentally two things come together. One is that, as far as the people are concerned, they of course they live with this corruption, and consequently it's easy to persuade them that their condition is because of corruption. I mean, corruption is really a non-explanation of anything. But on the other hand, you actually can persuade people because that's empirically something that they're exposed to. But on the other hand, the other thing that happened at that period is, I believe that this anti-corruption movement was also a very strongly middle-class supported movement. And I think it was a movement which also was against the Dalits, against reservations, against the poor coming up, which for various reasons, constitutional provisions and so on. You see, we have to see the emergence of Modi and his policies not just as being communal and anti-Muslim, but also being anti-Dalit and what is privatization? Privatization basically implies that in the private sector there are no reservations. So every time a unit or a production unit or a college or a university is shifted from public to private, or public doesn't happen and the private sector produces, reservations go. So it's a huge deprivation of the kind of socially backward kind of castes and so on. And I think the middle class supported that, and that itself was considered corruption, that these fellows are kind of giving away that all kinds of riff-raffs are being, a judge of the Supreme Court is somebody who really doesn't deserve to be the judge. He's there only because of reservations. All these stories get built up. And on the basis of those stories, then a whole regime gets discredited. So you're absolutely right. I agree with you that actually whoever manages to call corruption plays a very important role. I mean, now, for instance, PM Cares, there is just no accountability of on PM Cares funds. But on the other hand, this is an issue on which everybody is silent.
Thank you, Professor. So I don't see any more questions. So if you allow me, I can ask a question and then hand over to Dr. Raziuddin. So very interesting talk for the scientists like us to understand the economics. And please make me to understand a disconnect. You said that people are coming out of poverty in India, and everyone knows that. But hunger index is going up, and which is 100 first now. So what is disconnect? Because if there are people are going above the poverty line, but hunger index, people are more hungry than used to be.
That is why I would say that our poverty line estimation is not correct. In other words, it cannot be that people are coming out of poverty but are becoming hungry, because all over the world, there is a positive relationship between per capita real income and per capita absorption of food grains, cereals, let us say, all over the world. By the way, I mean here direct and indirect. In other words, not just direct consumption of food grains. No, that beyond a point people actually reduce. But direct and indirect in the sense of, animal products, processed food and so on. So if you take direct and indirect, then all over the world you find there is a positive relationship until very high levels of income, after which it tends to flatten. But we are well below that level of income. So per capita real income, if it is improving, then you should be finding greater absorption of food grains as far as the people are concerned. So the fact that we find this difference makes me feel that there is a problem about our poverty line. And that problem, as I was mentioning in reply to Akbar, is because of the fact that we don't, we don't adjust the poverty line in keeping with the inflation rate. If you make the same calculation today, namely what is the proportion of population below 2,200 calories, in that case, you would immediately get the answer is much higher than the supposed poor. But on the other hand, when you take poverty line, you find that it is actually much lower. That's because I believe the poverty line is underestimated, understated. And this is something which the Chinese also faced, and the Chinese just raised the poverty line, virtually doubled the poverty line in order to get what they thought was a more realistic estimate of poverty in China.
Thank you so much. Makes sense. So one more question came up, Nidhi Jain.
Yeah, thank you, sir. मेरा hand raise आपको कब से शायद दिख नहीं पाया. प्रभात सर नमस्ते. सर है ना, मुझे एक सवाल पूछना है जो कि दूसरे सवाल से जुड़ा हुआ है. जैसा कि कहा जाता है कि कल्याणकारी राज्य से हमारा क्या आशय है, क्योंकि जिस 5 प्रकारों का हम जिक्र कर रहे हैं और देख भी रहे हैं कि राइट टू फूड, एम्प्लॉयमेंट, एजुकेशन, हेल्थ और पेंशन, जो कि सही मायनों में जनता तक पहुंची ही नहीं है, तो हम कल्याणकारी राज्य की कल्पना कैसे कर सकते हैं और भारत को एक कल्याणकारी राज्य कैसे कहेंगे? दैट इज अ क्वेश्चन.
देखिए, there is nothing intrinsically wrong with Indians that they cannot have a welfare state. So if we do not have a welfare state, अगर हमारे पास है नहीं, then it is not because of the fact of it being impossible, but it's because of the fact that it has been attempted. There was a brief period, UPA 1, जबकि as कोशिश हुई थी, for instance, the idea of giving food grains to substantial proportion of the population. In fact, about 70% of the total population was supposed to get food grains. And that is the period that MGNREGS was introduced, which, if not exactly a right to employment, was actually in some ways providing people, in a very minimal sense, 1 person per household, which is really very small. But anyway, there was some effort to provide some relief to the people in terms of rights of this kind. But on the other hand, that was stillborn because UPA 2, this did not really take off, and afterwards it did not at all kind of get any encouragement. In fact, at this very moment, even though MGNREGS played such an important role in making people keep their noses above water during the pandemic में आपने देखा बहुत सारे लोग, they started going back to their villages, and what did they do in their villages? They actually joined MGNREGS, got some income, and with that income they managed to at least keep their noses above water by getting adequate nutrition. Lekin even that MGNREGS is now being wound down. In other words, wage arrears have got built up. Which is absurd, because after all, if you do your work, you should get your wages. Wage arrears have got built up, and MGNREGS funding is not going up. Therefore, even such limited gains we had made with regard to rights are being now whittled down. So the point is that there is nothing intrinsically wrong with our society that we can never have it, but it's because of the fact that the regime we have is one which is not sympathetic to it. So our idea should be to actually change the politics and to have a regime that actually can implement these kinds of rights.
Yeah, because I was a part of some schemes, जैसे NREGA ने जो मिनिस्ट्री ने स्टडीज करवाई थी, हमने देखा कि इन UPA 2 गवर्नमेंट के टाइम की बात है, तभी बहुत फायदा मिला था लोगों को, और फिर बाद में उसी स्कीम को अब्यूज करना शुरू कर दिया, और उसके बाद जब पेंडेमिक आया तो वही स्कीम भगवान बन गई, है ना? तो इस तरह से, लेकिन न सिर्फ एम्प्लॉयमेंट की बात है, फूड की भी बात है, पेंशन की भी बात है, एंड यू आर एब्सोल्युटली राइट कि पेंशन 200 रुपया देकर के आप क्यों गरीबों का मजाक उड़ा रहे हैं. तो अब मुझे लगता है कि हमारा विद्यार्थी या हम खुद अपने आप से स्वयं सवाल पूछें तो क्या हम एक कल्याणकारी राज्य में जी रहे हैं? इज इट यस एंड नो?
नहीं, जी तो नहीं रहे हैं, लेकिन जीना चाहते हैं, और उसमें जीने के लिए जिन चीजों की जरूरत है उसके लिए हमें we have to fight. We have to actually fight for those rights. Obviously, you cannot have these things being given by the largesse of the state. They have to be fought for by the people.
So, Professor, if you don't mind, there are two more hands were raised. Manojit Chatterjee Saab. And please go ahead, Chatterjee Saab.
Thank you. So, Prabhat, the policy question, given the pernicious influence of international finance capital and the constraints that it places on domestic policy, not just in India, all over the world, every government is, as you pointed out, with the exception of the US, because everybody wants to hold dollars. They can do whatever they are under, run deficits till kingdom come. Nobody else can do that. Would you advocate, as one way of insulating ourselves from this international finance capital, would you advocate a return to the kind of managed exchange rate regimes that we used to have until neoliberalization took over?
Yes, I would. Yes, I would.
Good. So would I.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. It was the shortest answer. Jay Chandran Saab. Jay Chandran Saab, please unmute.
Thank you.
And that would be the last question, and then I will pass it to Dr. Raziuddin.
Can you hear? Can you hear?
Yes, yes.
All we know that the repealing of farm loans is a strategical stand taken by the government. It is a strategical stand, not repealing from the neoliberal agenda. They will take the same in a different way. I would like to know what Prabhat Patnaik, your perception on cooperatives, producing cooperatives as not only as a sustainable model for the agriculture farmers, but also as a resistance, a way of resistance against the neoliberal program.
So yes, I agree with you that if corporate agriculture is to be avoided, and if it is the case that there are significant economies of scale in certain kinds of operations, certainly in marketing and so on, there would be significant economies of scale. There would even be economies of scale in farming. When I was an undergraduate student, there was a very important book which was written by Professor Khusro, who had actually argued for cooperatives in production on the grounds that actually there were, that you can build up infrastructure and so on, which an individual farmer cannot do. So I would argue that against corporate agriculture, to the extent there are economies of scale, cooperatives give the best promise. This is something which I believe in it, and I believe that also for building up infrastructure. One of the things that the Chinese communes did in the earlier period is that they actually, that in, let us say, a village, different families have got unutilized labor for different periods. I mean, let's say somebody is not using his labor for 2 days in the week, or let's say for a certain period in the month, or for a certain period in the year. Now you cannot shift that person out because this unutilized labor appears not necessarily in discrete units, but on the other hand, only in small quantities. I mean, that. Now, if you can pool all this within the village itself, and to the extent that they are not earning anything on this, you can actually have a system of deferred wage payment, namely that they actually get their wages after the work is completed and therefore output has increased. Then you get costless capital formation. So that's a very useful way of building up capital in agriculture, and therefore cooperative farming is a means of achieving that. So I would be very much in favor of cooperatives.
So thank you so much, Professor, all professors. It was an exciting talk. And back to Dr. Raziuddin.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rafat. Maybe I have a short question. Would it be better if we go back to Nehru's era, or that kind of semi-socialist state where nothing was going up or down? Nobody had any measurement for how many people are poor, what is going on, or how to evaluate this situation where a lot of, even from the marginalized communities in a free enterprise period, are getting employment. I mean, all qualified Muslim youths. So, say for example, mostly are as much employed as a Hindu qualified youth. So, is this a good period for a certain class only, and a bad period for all the poor people in India? Or that 5-year planning period where nobody really knew and somebody was getting something?
No, I would suggest that it is not a question of going back to the Nehruvian era. I would say that, I mean, in terms of many features of the economic regime, we may have to go back. But I believe that in addition to what was there in India earlier, we must institute a set of fundamental economic rights so that these conditions of the people are not made dependent upon the discretion of the state. Okay. So that's, I mean, I'm not saying that necessarily the state is going to do all this and so on. I mean, obviously, even political rights are being currently encroached upon. Right to freedom of expression is being encroached upon. But if we have a set of fundamental economic rights, then at least there'll be some compulsion, some restraint upon the government to provide these, so that it's not as if one government goes, another comes, and the people who are getting some help in the first government don't do so under the second. I think that is what I would suggest.
All right. So I guess,
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I'm just saying thank you, but asking one question, whether this government listen.
Go ahead, please ask if they're not right.
No, it's not a question. I'm just a satire. Does the Indian government listen to economists? Because they know
we did have a prime minister who was a very distinguished economist.
Who
ushered in neoliberalization.
This government
you are proposing the solution, you know the data, you know the numbers, you know everything. So why doesn't government listen to it? That's my
but listen, when demonetization happened, every economist, from Amartya Sen to everybody said it was a terrible thing. But on the other hand, the government mobilized film stars from Bombay, it mobilized cricketers and so on to say what a wonderful thing had happened. But now, of course, everybody recognizes it was a fiasco.
Yeah, it's a sad situation. Politics overpower everything.
I was actually in Mumbai when they did that, and the effect that it had on a place where I used to live in Colaba. I mean, if Akeel had walked down towards his old house, he would have been horrified, to the fact that what used to be a really crowded Colaba market was actually empty. Because these people didn't have bank accounts, you couldn't transact. What were they supposed to do for a livelihood? And the argument that I heard, which was the most depressing thing about this, was not even a rational argument about, or semi-rational, if you could construct a rational argument about why demonetization was a good idea. The only argument I heard was, but it's what they do in the United States. This is obviously someone who has never been to the United States. It's a largely cash-based economy. You can't write a check in a supermarket without 50 pieces of ID, as I discovered when I first went there. So this is all hogwash. The whole thing was, it's not about listening to economists or not listening to economists. It's about not even having a modicum of common sense. Never mind listening to economists like Prabhat. Nobody's going to listen to Prabhat in the Indian government. When has that ever happened?
Yeah, that's why we will remain.
Even the most poor one, a lot of followers are from the more marginalized community. A lot of followers for Modi. In spite of all their sufferings, they are still following and, voting for him. So that is another problem. The biggest problem in UP, you see that UP's condition, so much poor people. and they are going to put him back, or worse than him is Yogi, the same thing. Anyway, I think it's very late for you, at least in Delhi area, or not 11:30, I guess. And
Yes, it is.
yeah, so sorry for that, but thanks a lot. And we learned a lot. There are a lot of things to, contemplate or do, but it's very difficult. Gaur Saab, thank you for attending.
Thank you. I am going to ask Modi ji to listen to Prabhat Patnaik sir.
That will be the last thing for Modi, I guess.
By the way, I should say that the current finance minister was a student.
Oh my God.
Yeah, she was
Well, we are facing here in United States also within same party. You must have seen the moderates versus Bernie Sanders and all that going on. It's not that easy. I mean, there are two senators holding the entire program, I think.
It's always a treat to listen to Professor Prabhat Patnaik.
Yes.
Even reading his articles is like reading poetry.
No doubt about it.
Gaur Saab, your Kisan, your Nazm Kisan really prevailed. So Kisan,
that's true.
You were in the front lines, reciting your that was very powerful, really.
Yeah, Gaur Saab should go back there and celebrate.
He is already celebrating.
Yeah, yesterday I went there. There was so much of happiness, jubilation, and people were celebrating. Yeah.
Prabhatji, have you heard his very inspiring poem, Kisan?
किसान मैंने शायद नहीं सुना, but I've heard his poetry anyway.
गौर साहब सुना दीजिए अगर 2 मिनट इन लोगों को और थकान नहीं हो तो. I mean, that is really one thing.
क्यों जुल्म कर रहे हैं सब पे?
सुना दीजिए.
आपका हुक्म मैं सुना देता हूँ. तुम किसानों को सड़कों पे ले आए हो, अब ये सैलाब है और सैलाब तिनकों से रुकते नहीं. ये जो सड़कों पे हैं खुदकशी का चलन आए हैं, बेड़ियां पांव की तोड़कर आए हैं. सौंधी मिट्टी की सबने कसम खाई है और खेतों से वादा किया है कि अब जीत होगी तभी लौट कर आएंगे. अब जो आ ही गए हैं तो ये भी सुनो, झूठे वादों से ये टलने वाले नहीं. तुमसे पहले भी शातिर कई आए थे, तुमसे पहले भी जाबिर कई आए थे, तुमसे पहले भी ताजिर कई आए थे, तुमसे पहले भी रहजन कई आए थे, जिनकी कोशिश रही सारे खेतों का कुंदन बिना दाम के अपने आकाओं के नाम गिरवी रखे. उनकी किस्मत में भी हार ही हार थी और तुम्हारा मुकद्दर भी बस हार है. कल साबित हो गया जी. और तुम्हारा मुकद्दर भी बस हार है. तुम जो गद्दी पे बैठे खुदा बन गए, तुम जो गद्दी पे बैठे खुदा बन गए, तुमने सोचा कि तुम आज भगवान हो. तुमको किसने दिया था ये हक खून से, सबकी किस्मत लिखो और लिखते रहो. घर जमीन पर खुदा है कहीं भी कोई तो वो दहकान है वही देवता, वो ही भगवान है. और वही देवता अपने खेतों के मंदिर की दहलीज को छोड़कर आज सड़कों पे है. जालिमो जान लो, तानाशाहो सुनो, अपनी किस्मत लिखेगा वो सड़कों पे. अब काले कानून का जो कफन लाए हो, धज्जियां उसकी बिखरी हैं चारों तरफ. इन्हीं टुकड़ों को रंग कर धनक रंग में, इन्हीं टुकड़ों को रंग कर धनक रंग में आने वाले जमाने का इतिहास भी शाहराहों पे ही अब लिखा जाएगा. तुम किसानों को सड़कों पे ले आए हो, अब ये सैलाब हैं और सैलाब तिनकों से रुकते नहीं.